Hi, I'm Emi Golding from the Mental Health Recovery Institute, and I want to talk to you today about the concepts of dignity of risk and duty of care. This is something that's really poorly misunderstood in human services. So let's start with, this is a model that's been helpful for me to understand it and just to get some clarity around how we use these in our services. So imagine that there's a continuum between duty of care and we've got dignity of risk at the other end. So what do these terms mean? Let's start with duty of care, because this is often really misunderstood. Duty of care refers to the legal responsibility, I'll make a note here, legal responsibility that organisations have and the staff within them to do no harm to the people that they support. So in many cases, services and institutions have actually mistreated and abused clients, particularly in the past, although it still happens sometimes these days too. So duty of care was brought in to say that those organisations have a responsibility not to harm the people that they support. Now this is a little bit different from how it's sometimes understood, because people think that duty of care means I have to protect the client from themselves. I have to protect them from any mistakes that they make and make sure that they're not harmed in any way. That's not quite right. Remember, it's about protecting the person from us as services, not from their own choices. On the other side here, we've got dignity of risk. And dignity of risk refers to the right that every one of us has, whether we have a mental health issue or not. The right that we have to make choices and to take risks and even to make mistakes and get it wrong sometimes, so that we can learn from those mistakes. It's about learning, it's about mistakes. Ultimately, it's about freedoms. Now, historically, many services have started from this side. They've started on this end of the continuum thinking, well, I have to protect the person. I don't want to see them get in any harm. So they've bubble wrapped the person and not allowed them to actually experience life in many cases. And sometimes they've gone, all right, well, they've been well behaved and I feel comfortable. So, I'll let the person make some choices in one area when I feel safe to do so. What we're saying now, and what the policies and legislation in Australia is saying, is that we actually need to start from this end of the continuum, from dignity of risk, recognising that every single person has the right to decide how they want to live their life. And yes, there are some times when we do need to step into our duty of care, but our starting point is from this side, and sometimes we move across to duty of care, not the other way around. So what are some of those exceptions, some of those times when we do need to step into duty of care? Well, the law says it's when there's a risk of death or permanent disability. So one example of this would be in the case of suicide. That's a case where in Australian law we have the Mental Health Act, which says that a person does not have the right to kill themselves. In that case, services do need to step in, and the appropriate person who's authorised to do so can actually put the person in hospital even if they don't want to go, because they don't have that right. Permanent serious disability. If a choice the person's making is going to result in permanent serious disability, then again we can step into our duty of care and take action. Now this doesn't mean just a broken bone, it's got to be serious disability there. Another example where there's an exception is where there's a lack of capacity. So if it's determined that the person doesn't have the mental capacity to make decisions for their own life, that's another time when duty of care would operate. But that's not up to you and I to decide. That's actually got to be decided through a legal process. So we have tribunals where that's determined, looking at all the factors and getting information from all the people in the person's life. So if the person's deemed to have a lack of capacity, then our duty of care might step in to make choices for the person rather than them make them for themselves. And finally, another example where there's an exception to this rule is where there's involuntary treatment orders or community treatment orders. That means that the person's required to have treatment even if they don't want it. And again, that's decided through a tribunal, through a legal process. It's not our responsibility. It's only in those situations where we might make a decision on behalf of the person and their own choice is not respected. So that sort of raises the question, you know, people say, well, what about if someone's smoking and it's bad for them and they're not allowed, you know, that's going to cause lung cancer and it's going to impact on them. It could give permanent serious disability. So shouldn't we stop people from smoking? Well, not really, because if we think about it, remember every single one of us has the dignity of risk to make choices. So if you or I are allowed to smoke and we're allowed to give ourselves that disability, then so is the person that we're supporting. That's a good way to check. Is your average everyday person allowed to make this decision? And if so, then so is the client, unless there's a CTO in place. Another example would be, well, what if the person's eating unhealthily and they're going to be overweight and that could lead to obesity and all of the ill health that comes with that? Still, if you or I are allowed to overeat, we're allowed to make poor choices in that area, so is the person that we work with. So it's a shift in a way of thinking about this for many people, but ultimately it's about respecting the freedoms that the person has. Now, one of the problems that can come about is when people take this to the extremes. So if we look at duty of care, the extreme end of that is overprotection. So sometimes services get so worried that oftentimes that they're going to get in trouble. They're really worried that that's going to happen, so they overprotect the client and don't allow them to have these freedoms. At the other end, instead of dignity of risk, we get neglect. The person says, oh, well, dignity of risk, their choice to do whatever they want, and they go too far to the extreme. That's neglect, and that's not okay either. But neglect is, again, a legal term. And it's important to know, if we're worried about going too far that way, what are the legal requirements around neglect? Well, I'll just make a note of them here. In order to get in trouble with neglect, there's 3 things that have to happen. 1, it has to be proven that you had a duty, that you were the person responsible for stepping in. So in the case of in the workplace, if you weren't on shift, for example, you might not have a duty because you weren't the one responsible at the time. It's only by virtue of working in that organisation that you have a duty. The second is they have to show that there's been some breach, that you haven't taken reasonable steps appropriate to your job role and your training to protect the person from these things. So if you've done all the right things, what are reasonable steps? Well, it can be talking with the person about the potential impact of their choices, documenting that, speaking with your supervisor and colleagues, referring to the policies and procedures. They're all reasonable steps, and if you've done those, then you've protected yourself. And finally, the third one is injury. There has to be a serious injury, and again, we're talking death or permanent serious disability. If that doesn't happen, you can't be liable for neglect. So I know that's a lot of information, and it is a different way of thinking about things, but that's a rundown of how I make sense of duty of care and dignity of risk and how they fit together. Remember, the key point is we start from this place. Every single human being has the right to make decisions for themselves, and it's only in these cases that our duty of care steps in, where we take reasonable actions to support the person. I hope that's been helpful. Thank you.